Ask a law enforcement official or police officer about the most serious growing crime problem in New Jersey, and they'll most likely point to gangs. Soon after the Corzine administration rolled out its anti-crime initiative last year, the governor picked former East Orange Police Director Joe Cordero to become the state's first director of the effort to fight gangs, guns, and violent crime. Mr. Cordero is our guest this week, and he joins us to talk about the issue and his plans to make headway into addressing that problem. Mr. Cordero, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
And let's just give a little background in terms of where you came from. You did 21 years of police work in New York City, rose, we'll get into that a little more detailed, rose up to the rank of inspector over those years, then became police chief in Newton, Massachusetts, which, if my reading of the web is correct, is sort of an upper middle class suburb outside of Boston. And then several years ago, you came down to East Orange, I believe in '04, to be police director there, and made some pretty big headway into crime, as we'll talk about in a little bit here. What did you learn over those many years in law enforcement about gangs?
Well, I think one of the most significant things is that the gang culture is really a local culture. And that while we can look at other cities and other parts of the country that experience similar problems, we really need to get into the business of becoming a lot more informed. And so trying to deal with a problem, you know, by definition requires that we learn a lot more of it. And that's what this plan, or the governor's plan, really gets into. And
you've been on the job a couple of weeks now. January 14th, we said earlier that you began there. What's going on at this moment? Are you going to have your own staff? You report to the Attorney General, you have your own staff. What's happening right now? Yeah, actually, I'm going through a process of looking at the crime plan, which is in various forms of implementation, trying to put together a group of folks from different layers of law enforcement in actually carrying out the implementation. Now, will they be staffers answering to you, or are you going to use available folks that are in the state government right now? Actually, a combination of all. The Attorney General is very committed to getting this done. The Attorney General staff has been very helpful in formulating the plan and now in implementing the plan. We have a law enforcement coordinating council that we're putting together, experts from law enforcement throughout the state, as well as my own staff. You have, will you be, when you say your own staff, Division of Criminal Justice, you're working with some of those, and then I'm presuming here, division under the Attorney General, perhaps state police. How many of your own staff are you going to have, and will they be investigators, or are you just going to create this overarching plan using the existing infrastructure? Well, the staff, or my own staff, is really to actually get the work of the office done. But how many of those people are you going to need? Again, that's work in progress. Okay. As we go along, we'll identify what those staffing needs are. A dozen or 2 dozen? It could be. I don't want to speculate. Okay. But I do. We are working with the state police. We are working with the Division of Criminal Justice, and we're working with county prosecutors and local law enforcement. The pool is out there. It's a matter of bringing them all together to carry out the governor's crime plan. All right. I'd like to share with our viewers, as I mentioned a moment ago, some of these, to my mind, almost amazing drops in crime where you've been in these past number of years and related to where you're at and where you're going. New York City, Queens South, when you were the commander there, the largest reduction of any patrol bureau in New York City's history, or is that what I read? Did I read that correctly? Actually, I was maybe it was that year. Yeah, it was that year. Okay. Actually, I was I ended my career as the crime strategies inspector for Queens South. During that year, the Queens South Borough, Patrol Borough, had recorded the largest reduction in crime of any patrol borough. Okay, and then you went to Newton, Massachusetts after retiring, and in that city of 84,000 or so, upper middle class, it appeared to me, predominantly white from what I read on the website again. Total yearly crimes dropped below 1,000 for the first time in 30 years, and they got this safest city in America designation. You moved on from there. You went to East Orange, July '04. Urban, socioeconomically below the line in many instances. In that city, you went from 16.2 crimes per 1,000 in '04 to 10.6 in '06. The first 9 months and that's a decline of 56%, in the first 9 months of '07, down another 29% crime in there. How do you explain successes like that in three different, very different venues?
I've been very fortunate to, over the years, not only learn the industry, the law enforcement profession, but really learn about the things that work and don't work. And then applying that, and also adopting technology. One of the things in law enforcement, oftentimes we do things well, but we can't do enough of it. There is a lot of emerging technologies. In East Orange, we incorporated emerging technologies and field tested them out in the streets of East Orange, which helped us tremendously. But also, I have a management style that really is about people. It's policing from a people's perspective. See, I believe that if we take the time to understand what truly makes communities feel safe, we incorporate that into the strategies that we know how to execute well, and sort of take those priorities and make them where we want to go, and put our hearts and soul and knowledge behind it, you can attain these kinds of crime reductions. And
my thought is there's a big folks point to you and say, this man knows technology, intelligence-driven, all those types of phrases are put to your police work. And you read about in East Orange, there's cameras and there's gunshot sensors, and the cameras are linked to the gunshot sensors. And there's folks on Community Watch who have computers hooked into the password-driven at police headquarters. How much of this is technology-driven, and how much of that can you spread statewide?
Well, the reality is that, the technology is a real force multiplier for us. It allows us to do very important things. Intelligence-led policing, which is the model that the crime plan advocates, and really tries to bring about a change in culture and law enforcement in New Jersey, really necessitates that we look at technology as a partner. And we've done and acquired these different technologies. And in fact, many of those technologies are not in the market. Many of those technologies we were able to design ourselves, following the specific needs that we identified in our local communities. And so I think in terms of applying that same technology, information-led policing strategy throughout the state is a very doable objective, and one that I think will have a significant impact on violent crime and specifically gang crime.
Oh, we'll get back to that. I just want to read something that you had said last year in a published report about your work in East Orange. And you'd said, East Orange is making believers of even the most skeptical observers. It seems that we are capturing public imagination. A number of cities experiencing problems similar to those that we have successfully dealt with are coming to East Orange to find out what we are doing and how. It seems like you also got the notice of the governor, who then took you out of East Orange and asked you to do this for the state. But other cities and towns from around the country came there to find out what you were up to. Is that right?
That's correct. In fact, we had formal presentations prepared. We had a number of cities come through East Orange. In fact, as a result of that, because of the volume, back in December, we held a law enforcement seminar, essentially tracing the steps that we took in East Orange, incorporating intelligence-led policing, a policing philosophy that focuses on preventing crime rather than just in chasing crime around, and incorporating technology and other management principles.
And here's something from the Attorney General, what she had to say about what you're doing there and what you can do for the state of New Jersey. The adoption of data-driven, technologically supported, intelligence-led policing can and should serve as a model for police departments throughout our state. It's something to say that, and then it's another thing to implement it. Are there plans in the works as we speak? And one of the big things that comes to mind is, where do the dollars come from to, say, mount these cameras, to provide folks with computers in various neighborhoods? Can you give us some insight into that?
Certainly. The technology, end of it, in terms of the funding streams for those, And if you look at what we did in East Orange, you know, we were doing these during times of economic challenges to the city. And we're able to do it by diverting some of the existing funding, again, putting the funding behind and in support of our priorities and our plan. We looked at other funding streams, forfeiture funds. I think the crime plan talks about UEZ funding, external funding, federal funding. So I think that what we have to do is not become, you know, so much focus on technology, that technology is going to bring about the changes that we need, but we need to do a better job in law enforcement, using intelligence-led policing and other models, and then use technology when and how it will help us to further those goals. So, you know, I just want to get away from we need a camera in every corner. That's not what we need.
Right. And in suburbs and rural areas, it wouldn't seem to make sense with those great expanses of ground and that type of thing. Your thoughts on that? This sort of technology and its application in, say, suburban and rural areas where apparently gangs have been spreading?
Well, actually, again, it's going back to avoiding a cookie-cutter approach. You know, it really depends on the problem in terms of the urban or suburban landscape. There is appropriate circumstances where technology, different technology, can work very well, particularly when a problem is contained or isolated, or choke points. So there are, you know, there's a process.
Give us an idea. There's a choke point you just mentioned. First, before you give us that idea, how prevalent is the spread of gangs to, say, suburbs or rural areas? We hear all the time that gangs are moving out from the inner city to those places, from the West Coast to here, now from the inner cities to suburbs, rural areas. How prevalent?
Well,
and then in New Jersey, generally, if you would.
Well, in general, in New Jersey, if we look at the survey, the New Jersey State Police survey, gang survey for last year, we talked about an increase in gang activity. And a lot of the spread or increase in that gang activity was in the southern part of the state. And also towns that previously reported not experiencing a gang problem were now starting to see indications of gangs infiltrating suburban and urban areas. And the danger with that is that, you know, many suburban and urban police departments have not dealt with this kind of problem before. So, you know, the problem recognition and knowing how to respond effectively at the outset is important if we're going to contain and sustain those areas that were formerly gang-free. And what I mean by using technology and really using assessments to drive what we do, it could be that in a rural community, there may be 1 or 2 ways in or out. And if the problem is an external problem, then of course those choke points afford us opportunities to leverage technology in a way that to be able to detect that kind of activity in and out of the community. But there are a variety of different circumstances in which technology can be effective, but so can law enforcement approaches that are focused, you know, on the issue. And it all comes down to how much do we really know about the problem.
Yeah, this may be outside your bailiwick. There are those who say administrations, not just this one, but wherever around the country, attentions are only paid now that it is moving, the problem is moving into, say, more affluent white areas. Nobody cared when it was in a black inner city, is what there was some criticism to that effect out there. Can you speak to that at all? I recognize that's not strict law enforcement. It might be policy or politics, but can you speak to that mindset?
Well, I can speak to it insofar as a law enforcement representative. And I have served the vast majority of my career in inner cities. And I can tell you the commitment from law enforcement and from others has been one that has been there all along. We have been dealing with this problem. We have learned. We're getting better at dealing with this problem. And so that the problem is now spreading and it's getting attention. I think what's really getting the attention of you know, elected officials throughout the state and other parts of the country is the violence, is the increase and prevalence of firearms-related violence, no matter where that violence is occurring.
What is it about gang culture that precipitates this over-the-top, if you will, use of violence and weapons and that type of thing, more so perhaps than other criminal elements in a different time?
Well, there are a combination of factors. I mean, obviously, if you're in a gang, there's always a danger of a confrontation with opposing gangs. If you are in a profit-motivated gang or gang that involves themselves in illicit activities, drug dealing, there's a fear that you may be robbed. And so there are different things that drive folks to arm themselves. And unfortunately, when they arm themselves, disputes, just everyday, disagreements all of a sudden turn violent. And that's an issue that we look to address in the crime plan, trying to get the guns off the streets and the easy accessibility to guns.
Let me make a left turn here and just ask, wanted to ask about this from the get-go. Those Newark killings, those heinous schoolyard assassination-style killings of innocent college kids last summer, was it ever determined whether that was gang-related or not?
I'm not certain as to the end result of that investigation, so I don't really want to comment on it because I don't have all the information.
Okay. Last month, the Attorney General announced the arrest of 2 top Lucchese crime family bosses on illegal gambling and money laundering charges. I think it was a $2 billion ring, $2+ billion. And then there were some episodes of criminality alleged regarding East Jersey State Prison, and that this was what the Attorney General at the time called a, quote, alarming alliance between members of the Bloods street gang and the Lucchese crime family. Are you seeing more of this connection between the older organized crime and the younger street gang?
That is always a danger when you have a maturing gang problem. Initially we began with loose-knit organizations and folks coming together and perpetrating, street-level gang activity and violence. And then you get, a maturing process where these gangs get a lot more sophisticated and make alliances with untraditional alliances and grow in terms of the type of criminal activity they're involved in. And so the danger always is that unless we deal with these groups effectively, meaningfully, and now rather than later, you will see the growth and expansion of that type of collaboration, which is a dangerous collaboration.
Is that something that you're looking at, or are you mindful of that as you map out a strategy?
Absolutely. And the strategy really focuses on a common sense approach. We have gangs throughout the state, different municipalities. We look at those gangs and determine which ones present the highest danger of becoming involved in those kinds of activities, firearms activity. And then within that gang, who are the worst of the worst? And then looking at ways, or weak links, so to speak, to go after those folks and get them off our streets before they're able to engage in the kind of violence that spreads fear throughout our community.
Are there other cases along these lines that you're aware of or that you can speak about? Or
I can't speak to what we're finding in our assessment because it would compromise investigations, but we are concerned that this kind of a problem will spread.
One of the problems overarching over the years, and the New York Times has put reporters on this specifically, watching trials around the state because they found it of such high interest that way and such difficult barricade for you folks in law enforcement, is this issue of witness intimidation. How do you get around putting somebody on the stand to point the finger at a Blood or a Crip or whomever, tearing up the neighborhood, shooting weapons, killing people, and then their own family is their safety is at stake, their own lives are at stake, their children's lives because of what these gangs have been known to do. How are you dealing with that witness intimidation? Is there a way to deal with it? And is it on your radar screen?
Absolutely. The governor's crime plan calls for an examination of the existing witness protection programs at the various levels of government, identify where the problems are, where we need to make changes to help make witnesses feel safer and to actually make them safer. There's 2 other ways. The crime plan, which I am very much in favor of, this particular aspect of it we've done in East Orange, we've done in other cities, and that is, look, oftentimes we have a case where a witness may feel that they don't want to come forward, they don't want to testify. We know who perpetrated the crime, and we've got to get that individual off the street. The idea of intelligence-led policing is saying, if we can't bring this person to justice on this case, then let's find a legal way, a lawful way, because they're involved in other forms of illegal activity. Let's target those individuals before they can commit other crimes and put them in jail where they belong. And third, the use of technology. You know, we talked about the Community Virtual Patrol Program, which you started the program mentioning. That's a way for communities, for example, to get involved anonymously. Anonymous hotlines and tip lines. You know, we encourage involvement in safe ways. But the final way is for law enforcement to follow the information trail. By the way, the information trail is just not collecting data. It's getting input from communities in anonymous ways that say, hey, these are the folks that are causing us harm. And finding ways of getting them off the street without overly relying on witness identification.
With this neighbors, looking at neighbors anonymously, contacting police through the website that you used in East Orange, for example, the secret, that's what I read them to be, secret cameras. I suppose you don't want criminals to know exactly where these cameras are around town, for example. Is there a concern for stepping on folks' freedoms and civil liberties, where it's a police state? Your neighbor might be watching you. The telephone, there might be a camera on the telephone pole you didn't know about last week. It's there this week, where there's just too many prying eyes, say, into lives of the innocent, for example. Any concerns there about actually, civil liberties and...
Yes. Let me just clarify what the program is, because it's not, that's not the program. The program really is nothing more than our citizens, what they look at is are still photos of their community. And all they're looking at those still photos for is for a reference point. No different than if a community member looked out the window, saw something suspicious, called the police and said, this is where it's going on. All they're doing is going to their computer screen, using still photos. They don't look at live feed, they don't look at cameras, and say, by the way, I see something suspicious. They point with the mouse pointer at the exact location where they're seeing it, and they hit send. Our cameras then turn to those specific locations. And what that does is within a second, we're looking at what the community resident is reporting. No more waiting 20 minutes for the police to drive by, and then when they do drive by, the problem is gone. No more having to rely on that witness. We can now take control of the camera and develop probable cause in cases of criminality, where we can arrest the offender without implicating the witness.
Very interesting. Have you, in your many years of doing this type of work, have you met with the ACLU or civil libertarians? As we know, the camera is ubiquitous now in our lives, whether it's the elevator or the parking garage or the street corner. Your thoughts on, just generally, on whether it can be too invasive or whether this is just the right touch, you know, just what was just the prescription needed?
It's amazing. I did speak to representatives from the Constitutional Project in Washington early on. I heard their concerns, and I was happy to report that we're pretty much in line with those guidelines and concerns. And I've got to say something else. In East Orange and in other places, there isn't a camera that is secret. Everyone knows where those cameras are. In fact, my problem wasn't that I was going to have a community problem when I sort of put a camera in a community. It was I didn't have enough cameras to go around. Folks wanted those cameras. You know, there's a diminished expectation of privacy in public places. And we don't have cameras pointed at or looking at private locations. And so to the degree that folks feel safer, and remember, we're really talking about fear of crime here. We can stand in front of anyone and tell them that crime dropped 70%. If they don't feel safer, if they're still fearful of having their children play out in the streets, then we got to ask ourselves, what have we really accomplished? Surveillance cameras oftentimes provides that layer of sense of safety.
We just have a few minutes left here, actually less than 2 minutes. Is there an educational component here, in addition to law enforcement, in terms of steering kids away from what might be an allure of gang culture? I understand a lot of times it has to do with not being in a family, looking for a family. Educational component, will that be part of your office or another office, or is it an important part of battling this problem? Well,
as you know, the governor's crime plan calls for 3 components: enforcement, prevention, and reentry. And the prevention component, I just want to mention how important that really is. In East Orange, we reduced crime by nearly 70% in 4 years. Juvenile arrest declined by 72% over the same time period. In order for prevention programs to work, we need to attack the lure out in the street. They spend 4 or 5 hours, kids, in constructive programs, and they have to go back to their communities and live 20 hours with the presence of gangs. So working in conjunction, along with the reentry piece, which try to get folks back to the community in a constructive way, are all important aspects of the plan.
That reentry, last word for you. Reentry, is that more difficult with gang members than it would be with other types of criminals? We have just a few seconds left.
I don't think so. I think that, again, attacking the problem using the 3 components, when these folks get out of jail, get back to their community, there's lesser presence of gang and pressure to rejoin gangs. I think the reentry component can succeed.
All right, well, we wish you luck in that very tall order that you have in your latest challenge that you've given yourself, and we appreciate you coming in here to talk with us today about it. Mr. Cordero, that is Joe Cordero, who has been with us as our guest this week, and that is it for this week's edition of On the Record. Be sure to watch Reporters Roundtable with Michael Aaron Friday nights at 6:30 and Sunday mornings at 10. This week's Roundtable was taped before an audience at the Insurance Council of New Jersey breakfast during the annual Chamber of Commerce trip to Washington. I'm Jim Hooker. Thanks for watching. See you back here next week.